And around it are bike rack barricades as well. And that is typical for any major event in and around the Capitol after January 6th. But we're told by Capitol Police that they are on high alert after false reports of an active shooter yesterday in the building. So while they say there is no security threat, they are, of course, being very vigilant. As for the crowds here, we now have a point of comparison. Of course, we've covered the indictment and arraignments of former President Trump in Florida and New York. And I will tell you, Caroline, the number of people that we have seen outside of the courthouse so far is nothing compared to what we have seen on those two previous occasions, Caroline.
And Madeline, what do we expect when Trump arrives? We are watching his motorcade leave Reagan National Airport right now, expecting him to arrive perhaps 20 minutes from now. What can we expect when he arrives and heads to the courtroom?
Yeah, we're hearing from sources that there's still a possibility that Trump could go inside the courthouse through the front entrance, but the preference of the Secret Service is for him to go through a garage, as you mentioned. And once he's here, Trump's court appearance is expected to be pretty quick. He will be processed like any other criminal defendant. He will be fingerprinted. He won't have a mugshot taken. Instead, another previously taken photo of the former president will be uploaded. He will appear before a magistrate judge, and he will be read the charges against him. And if this is a formal arraignment, we do, of course, expect him to plead not guilty. Bond conditions will be set, but there will be no jail or bail time. So all in all, this should be pretty routine and pretty cursory. Caroline.
And President Trump and his lawyer have said he cannot get a fair trial in D.C. They've actually suggested it be moved to West Virginia. Any chance of that?
They can certainly make that argument, Caroline, but the judge here will take over the case. Judge Tanya Shutkin. It's unlikely that she will go for this, Caroline. Several other January 6 defendants have made that case before, and they were unsuccessful. Caroline?
Madeline Rivera reporting from the D.C. courthouse, just a short 3 blocks away from the D.C. bureau. Now let's listen in to Fox News coverage of this breaking news.
That the poll that really stood out to me, 71% of Republicans say that it's time to stick with President Trump. Stand behind, I think, are the words there. What do you think?
Yeah, and this only helps him. We've seen every time there's an indictment, it helps in fundraising, it helps in polling, and this is good messaging for him. Months ago, before the first indictment here in New York, he was asked, will you drop out of the race if you'll get indicted? And he said, no, I think it'll help my numbers. I mean, he's very prescient about that. Like you said, he's got a good ear for these things, and he understands. And, you know, not far from where he's going to be, by the Capitol, by the White House, another block past that is the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's where some of these things may end up, because these are all uncharted territory, brand new cases, brand new theories in many ways. To see a former president facing dozens and dozens of criminal charges, these are questions that could end up there with those justices, 3 of them who came on his watch. So a lot of legal wrangling to go. The judge he's going to ultimately face in this case has been very tough on the January 6 defendants who have come before her. She sentenced 38. All of them have gotten prison time. She's ruled in 2021 against the president on something regarding documents for the January 6 committee. So his team has got a very, very long uphill battle with this judge and jury probably in D.C. too.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with one thing there. Do you think that these cases go to trial before the election?
I have doubts about that. I mean, there's so much pretrial wrangling that you do, motions, interlocutory appeals, especially in the Mar-a-Lago case. You've got so many classified documents there that people will file challenges to. You have to winnow all that down before you can actually take it to a jury. So I have real doubts that the federal cases could get there.
Yeah, plus there's the other layer of whether or not it is appropriate to bring a case that close to an election. So I think that's something to really watch closely. Jessica, I was just listening to Andy McCarthy, and he said something, he says a lot of interesting things, but he said something that really caught me in just a moment ago. He said, everyone in America, I'm paraphrasing Andy, sees the haste to get these cases to trial on a political calendar. How do you think that reflects on Democrats?
Well, I think it reflects fine on Democrats because the cases aren't being brought by the Democrats. They're being brought by a special counsel, and he's being indicted by a grand jury. He's not being indicted by Andy McCabe and Peter Strzok sitting in a room, and people tend to forget that. And I've heard so much about the potential biases of this judge in D.C. look at the judge that he got in Florida. He got someone that he appointed who already ruled in favor of him with the special master and then had to be overruled by the 11th Circuit. So, you know, it's a bit of this and a bit of that, right? Like, oh, I love the people of South Florida. I can't get a fair shake with the people in D.C. Well, don't commit crimes in D.C. if you don't want to see a jury of D.C. residents. That's how it works. Don't commit crimes at all, and you could just be running like a normal candidate. I think I was particularly struck by Bill Barr's interview last night. He was with Caitlin Collins, and he went long, right? I thought this was going to be one block, and he stayed until about 40 minutes into there and really gave a whole host of opinions on this. And one thing that particularly struck me was that he thought that the indictment was stronger than he expected it to be. So he thinks the Mar-a-Lago case, the classified documents case, is the strongest. And there's agreement, I think, on both sides of the aisle that, you know, with the audio tapes and the pictures, et cetera. But Bill Barr was saying that this is now a case that he understands why it was brought, and that there was new information there, specifically with Mike Pence's testimony, which to the January 6th committee was not able to get.
Yeah, he said that arguments of freedom of speech doesn't protect you from
actions,
from conspiracy. Yeah. And if they can prove that link, I think the links are difficult. They're tenuous in many ways when you try to connect those two things together. But we're going to continue with our panel in just a moment. Our team of great coverage here of the former president's Trump arraignment. You see the vehicles as they make their way across here. And we have coming up, we'll talk to Bret Baier, we'll talk to Neil Cavuto, we'll talk to Andy McCarthy later this hour. Also joining us, Jonathan Turley. Congressman Jim Jordan weighs in. We've got a lot going on here today because we now have this transcript from what Devin Archer actually told the Oversight Committee. And now President Joe Biden about their interactions with Hunter and his business partners. Wow, this is fascinating as well. So they will be here in moments. Don't go anywhere. Lots going on in the story.
You have been watching Fox News coverage of this breaking news at this hour. Former President Donald Trump arriving at Reagan National Airport, now making his way in a motorcade, driving about 20 minutes to the D.C. federal courthouse, where we expect him to be brought through in a garage. Possibly we will not see the former president, but a judge will after he is electronically fingerprinted. No mugshot, we are told, will be taken, but then he will enter a courtroom and speak in front of a federal magistrate. He will plead not guilty, we are told, to the 4 counts against him. That should be coming in the next few minutes. There are so many charges against the former president. I want to do the breakdown for you. If you take the 3 jurisdictions, state and now 2 federal jurisdictions where he's charged, there are 78 counts. In this case, however, in D.C., only 4 counts against the former president. Let's roll through them. Count 1 is conspiracy to defraud the United States. That, of course, involved those fake electors, those electors that the president and his allies said should vote for him instead of the duly elected electors who were supposed to vote for President Biden. That's count 1. Now, count 2 is conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. That, of course, refers to the January 6th count of the actual electors. What he did, according to prosecutors, was to wage this pressure campaign against Mike Pence, his vice president, who was the one who would officially sign off making Joe Biden the next president of the United States. Trump and his allies, his legal allies, were trying to make Pence not sign those and instead endorse these fake slates of electors. Now, count 3 is also related to January 6th. That is obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. Both of those counts are felonies, as the other 2 counts against him. Now, count 4, that is a conspiracy against rights, trying to block legally cast ballots in the 2020 election. That is according to prosecutors, and was the case with his previous arraignments. We are not expecting to see the former president. What you are looking at right now is the drive many of us take to work here in the D.C. Bureau. We're just a couple blocks away from the Prettyman Federal Courthouse. That is a motorcade. That is a live camera you see going on 395 there, probably 2 or 3 minutes before the former president arrives to the courthouse to face this federal magistrate. Now, outside of the courthouse, we are told by my colleague, Madeline Rivera, things are pretty calm. Law enforcement is absolutely everywhere. Of course, it's within a stone's throw of the United States Capitol. That was the center of all this on January 6th when the riot happened. 1,000 cases against the folks who broke into the Capitol that day have been filed and are now working their way through the federal courthouse. Many of those folks have actually been charged in the very courthouse where President Trump is about to arrive as he's going through the tunnel, emerging any moment. Now, we possibly won't see President Trump at all. There is a garage on the back side of there. You can drive into it. It's underground, and there's a back way for the former president to get into the Prettyman Federal Courthouse. That, of course, is what a Secret Service detail, who's already checked the place out, that's what they want. They want the least exposure to President Trump possible. But, of course, President Trump has often spoken in the past about how he gets a bump in his poll numbers every time he gets indicted. He gets a bump in his fundraising. On July 16th, when he was notified that he got this target letter, he shortly sent out a fundraising campaign and raised more money of that. So it is possible under one scenario that he walks in the front door of the D.C. federal courthouse. But of course, law enforcement has been trying to convince him, keep a low profile, do not be exposed, just walk in and go to the courtroom. We will not see him in the courtroom. However, there are no cameras allowed anywhere in the hallways and certainly not in the courtroom at this courthouse. Now, we have heard from President Trump on social media. Last night at about 11 p.m. he was posting and back at it again today. Here's the quote: "I need one more indictment to ensure my election." He was likely referring to the bump he gets in the polls and in fundraising anytime he is indicted. Now, this new indictment alleges the former president and his allies were engaged in a massive criminal conspiracy to ensure he stayed in office, centering on the so-called fake elector scheme. What the president did with some of his legal allies, they came up with a plan in those 7 states that Joe Biden had barely won. They came up with a fake elector scheme that they would substitute in, thereby keeping the president in office past January 20th. Of course, that failed. He did not do that. It was after the January 6th attempted coup. However, he did indeed leave office. Now, that plan would have been in some of the battleground states to falsely sign documents certifying Trump as the winner instead of Biden. Prosecutors are also accusing Trump of deliberately deceiving his supporters, directing them to march on the Capitol, even though he knew he lost the election. Let's dip back into live coverage by Fox News.
I didn't think I would ever see that.
Well, I do think the end result, the takeaway is I think this just strengthens, just hardens the support for President Trump and, frankly, expands it. I think Dana was mentioned earlier in the show that, you know, you look at the poll numbers earlier in the week. I think it's 54-17 in the Republican primary. But more importantly, he's dead even with Joe Biden in the New York Times poll. So my gut tells me that's what the New York Times is saying. It's probably better for President Trump in that in another poll. And this, I think, only, again, hardens his support, expands his support, because the country gets it. And I think the reason that's happening is so much of the country is sick of this nonstop attack, this ridiculous attack on President Trump for 7 years now. And they're tired of this elite attitude in D.C. that says, oh, we're better than everyone else. There's a different set of rules. And I think people in flyover country, hillbillies in Ohio or Iowa or Oklahoma, they're so sick of it. We're so sick of it. We're saying we're going to support President Trump. I think that's the takeaway. I think that's the result of all this.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely echoed in the polls that you just mentioned and that we were all talking about just moments ago. It's clear, and it's clear that President Trump, the former president, knows that. He said in his Truth Social post just a short time ago, you know, basically, I'm doing this for you. I don't mind doing this. It's an honor or something like that because I'm doing this for you. It's fascinating to watch this play out, and especially so in the wake of what we're seeing on the other side of the aisle with this Hunter Biden investigation. I just want to put this up while we're waiting for this arrival, and I'll cut out of this if we see that arrival, guys.
Sure.
This is pretty interesting. This is a letter that Joe Biden wrote to Devon Archer in 2011. He was, I guess, they were just starting out in this business, trying to put together a business that dealt with government regulatory measures and making that into a private equity fund, and, you know, all sort of under the auspices of the support that they would get from Washington at that time, and ostensibly the vice president. Dear Devin, he says, I apologize for not getting a chance to talk to you at the luncheon yesterday. I was having trouble getting away from hosting President Hu, the president of China, by the way. I hope I get a chance to see you again with Hunter. I hope you enjoyed lunch. Thanks for coming. And then he signs it, and then a little PS. He says, happy you guys are together. What do you make of this letter and his contention that he doesn't have any connection to his son or Devin Archer in these businesses that they were running?
Just one more piece of evidence that he did have connections. And remember, 2.5 years ago, we had a former business partner, Mr. Bobolinsky, say that the email from the laptop we now know was real. The FBI knew was real at the time. The email, it says 10% for the big guy. He says the big guy is Joe Biden. We have the piece of evidence you just talked about there, this note from 2011. We have the WhatsApp message we now know because of the whistleblowers that came forward where Hunter Biden sitting beside his dad say, send the money or else my dad who's sitting beside me is going to do something. Then we have the 1023 form, which says, you know, the confidential human source who've been trusted by the FBI, talking with foreign nationals, sending money to the Bidens for certain political outcomes, certain policies.
You have been listening to live coverage of Fox News and the indictment of former President Donald Trump. We are joined once again by our colleague Madeline Rivera. Madeline, what's it like outside the courthouse now?
You know, it hasn't changed much, Caroline, since we last spoke to you a few minutes ago. I mean, we do have a group of pro-Trump supporters as well as anti-Trump protesters over here. But again, as we have talked about in the last few minutes, when we compare it to what we've seen in New York and Florida, we're just not seeing that same numbers over here. But we can expect this crowd to potentially build as former President Trump gets closer to the courthouse and as he leaves the courthouse as well, Caroline.
You mentioned some of those other cases. These 4 counts today are among the 40 that Trump is facing in New York, Florida, and now Washington, D.C. You were in Miami. Take us through that process. How does this compare?
I think we're going to see a similar process play out as we saw in Miami. But when you talk about those previous cases, you know, as you mentioned, Caroline, we have been here before as it relates to New York and Florida. But there are some that would say that this case is so much grander in scope because you have special counsel Jack Smith accusing the former president here of spearheading this multi-pronged effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election, subverting the will of the voters, which is the bedrock of American democracy, by the way, and continuing to spread these claims of election fraud despite knowing, according to special counsel Jack Smith, that former President Trump knew that what he was saying was untrue. And we have seen a bit of a preview of what Trump's legal defenses would be. Former President Trump's attorneys say that he was protected under the First Amendment. But you can see in the indictment that special counsel Jack Smith laid out, he undercuts that argument, saying that Trump did indeed have the First Amendment right to say that there was election fraud. But what he says Trump did not have a right to do was orchestrate the scheme to overturn legitimate votes. Trump's legal team could also argue that Trump did not have corrupt intent, that he truly believed that the election was stolen. But again, Smith also acknowledges that in the indictment, saying that Trump did know that what he was doing was not true, was that these claims of election fraud were not true because he was told repeatedly by people in his inner circle, from his former vice president to senior officials in the DOJ, that there were no legitimate claims of election fraud. Caroline.
Another possible defense is he had lawyers. He had Rudy Giuliani, he had Sidney Powell, he had John Eastman, he had other legal advisors who were giving him these ideas, saying, yes, indeed, this is legal. You can have these fake electors. You can take these other steps. Could he possibly use advice of counsel as a defense?
Sure, he could say that as well, but you had other members of the White House counsel who were also telling him that what he was doing, again, was not right and that there were no legitimate claims of election fraud. And you mentioned those names. Those could potentially be named as co-conspirators in this indictment. As we saw in the indictment, there were 6 co-conspirators who were unidentified. But we have been able to deduce at Fox who some of those co-conspirators could be based on the descriptions in this indictment. So John Eastman, for people who might not be familiar with him, he is a constitutional lawyer who who many see as the architect of this scheme to overturn the 2020 election results. He was behind this plan to submit a false slate of pro-Trump electors. In fact, his legal team told Fox a couple of days ago that they do in fact believe that their client will be named as a co-conspirator. As for the other names that we potentially could see named eventually, or could see charges in the future days or coming weeks perhaps, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Jeffrey Clark, and there are potentially other people as well that Fox just hasn't been able to confirm just yet, Caroline.
So many charges. We mentioned 40 charges if you add up the New York case and the Florida case, and now here in Washington, D.C. Let's take people through it. You were up there in New York. He faces charges in New York City over alleged hush money payments to an adult film star. Can you review that for us?
So that might be a little abstract for people to get, but in short, right, he was accused of making hush money payments in 2016 and the days leading up to the 2016 election. Now, hush money payments are not illegal, but it's just the way that they were documented in the books of the Trump organization, and that was the core of that indictment, that case. I just don't want to get into the weeds of this, Caroline, because I think a lot of it goes over people's heads. And then the other case, of course, is the classified documents case in Florida, and that one's a little bit easier to grasp. Trump is alleged to have mishandled classified documents after he left the White House. There was obviously that unprecedented search of his Mar-a-Lago home last year in which hundreds of classified documents were found in his estate, and Trump has made the argument that he had free reign over those documents, and he could have kept them and done whatever he could with them, which of course is a theory that legal experts have tried to pierce. Caroline?
And Madeline, we're talking about 3 cases here before November 2024. The Trump legal team wants the judges to push this past the election. They lost that battle in Florida. There's now a court date set in that case in May, although legal experts do say that will likely slide. How will they possibly get through all of these cases, all of the time that President Trump, former President Trump, needs to be spent in a courtroom? How can they combine that with his campaign schedule?
Well, I think that's the logistical question here, right? We are in unprecedented territory here, Caroline. So we've seen former President Trump see a bump in the polls after the past 2 indictments. When it comes to fundraising, he's seen a bump, but we're starting to see data shows that the fundraising is starting to get a little bit lower. He didn't raise as much after the second indictment as compared to what he raised in New York. But there is also this logistical complication here. So former President Trump, as you mentioned, his trials in the New York case, the hush money payments case, as well as the classified documents case, those are set to begin in March and May of next year. And of course, Trump will be in the thick of campaign season. So there's very much a scenario here where we could see former President Trump peel away from the campaign trail for days, potentially weeks at a time to attend these trials. Caroline?
And Madeline, the next twist in this could come in Georgia. We are now waiting to find out if he'll be indicted by a Georgia grand jury in Fulton County. The DA there potentially bringing charges related to him trying to overturn the election that Joe Biden won in Georgia and throughout the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about what we expect in that potential case?
We could potentially see this entire scenario play out all over again. So a grand jury in Georgia is weighing state charges against the former president in regards to his and his allies' efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis said over the weekend that her office is done with their work. They have been working over the last 2.5 years. They are ready to move forward with charging decisions. So after here in D.C., our eyes will shift over towards Georgia, and we could see something similar in Georgia.
And Maddie, we were looking at the live pictures of the courthouse. It looks like a swarm of folks, but everyone seems pretty calm. I can hear someone singing behind you. We see a very heavy police presence. It looks like many of the streets down there are closed, a line of satellite trucks. We will now go to live coverage with Fox News.
From the Capitol where the January 6th riots happened. Instead, he came down the 3rd Street and turned into the garage. His motorcade went in there. What's happening at this moment, we believe to be happening, is the processing. Before he goes before a magistrate judge, he'll be processed. He'll have his fingerprints taken. There will be no mug shot. He will not be arrested. But once he gets through the processing and he's in the hands of the U.S. Marshals, he will then make that initial court appearance, and the court confirms for us that he will be arraigned. He'll be flanked by his attorneys, Todd Blanche and John Lauro, in the lead there. We fully expect he will plead not guilty to the 4 felonies he's facing. 3 are conspiracy charges. 1 is an obstruction charge. Now, the magistrate judge who'll go before today is not the judge that will preside over the trial. That is a judge named Tanya Chutkan, a 2014 Obama appointee. She'll deal with the majority of the trial. This is just the initial court appearance and the arraignment, and this magistrate judge. We don't expect it to take a long time. The scene out here, by the way, obviously heightened security. You can see the U.S. Marshals put up railing all around here. A lot of law enforcement, a handful of protesters, some for the president, some against the former president, and a lot of media. It somewhat resembles a scene we saw in June when we were down in Miami outside the courthouse when former President Trump was arraigned for alleged mishandling of classified documents. But it's a little less of a circus, but nonetheless certainly historic in nature. We have no idea exactly what the former president will do afterwards. You remember in Miami, Martha, he went to a Cuban restaurant and was very visible to the public. We're not sure exactly what's going to happen now, but we do know this. He will finish this being arraigned on his 3rd indictment in 4 months, a total across the New York charges, the Miami charges, and the D.C. charges, 78 total crimes he's facing. It's really stacking up the legal woes for the former president. Martha?
All right. Griff Jenkins, thank you very much. Outside the courthouse in Washington, D.C., let's bring in our next excellent panel. We've got Neil Cavuto, anchor of Your World, Brett Baer, Fox News chief political anchor and executive editor and anchor of Special Report, and Andy McCarthy is back with us, former federal prosecutor, Fox News contributor, and Jonathan Turley, constitutional attorney, GWU law professor, and also a Fox News contributor. Great to have all of you with us. Thank you so much for being here. Neil, let me start with you. Your thoughts as we hear that the president is inside having his fingerprints taken for the 3rd time in this indictment.
You know, we're getting used to this, aren't we, Martha?
Yeah,
it's weird.
Right?
It's very, very weird. But I was thinking of just what the former president is facing and what his outlook calendar would look like as they pen in all these events that are coming up. And I know they're all moving targets, but you've got just potentially a couple of months away an investigation into the president's finances and a potential extended session at that. In January, you're going to have the 2nd part of the Jean King civil rape case. That's something he has to deal with in March. Maybe the whole hush money case and payments to porn stars and all of that. Then you get past that and the big trial, the whole Mar-a-Lago document thing, that is probably the most significant of all of these for the time being. But I always say for the time being, because some of these, obviously the president would like to push off and maybe delay it until past the election. I don't know whether that could be done with all of these. And we have another one coming up potentially from Georgia regarding the president's role or alleged role in the recount there and whether he was trying to force it his way. But just to keep track of that and to understand that this is a guy is the leading candidate by a country mile for president of the United States in the Republican Party, and dead even money, if not better, in a general election rundown, despite all of this, maybe because of all this, it is just staggering.
It really is. And you know what, let's go back to that. Neil, thank you for laying that out. We have that on the big board down there as well. And if I could just ask you to take a close look at that down there. And this is really astonishing. So on the upper level here, you've got, starting with the debate on August 23rd, you've got all the political events, right, which ends with the election in November. Along the bottom, you have all of these different court appearances. It is truly stunning, Brett, when you look at this matchup in what has been called a rotating carnival of courthouses and rallies. This is we talk about unprecedented a lot, but this combination, very unprecedented in presidential election cycle.
Yeah, Martha, good afternoon. I think Neil put his finger on it. This is surreal. It really is. But to Dana's point at the beginning of the show, it's also ordinary now in our 3rd indictment and our 3rd roundabout on this. This election will be nothing like we've ever seen before. The 45th president is running for the White House again. His vice president, served with him, is now a part of this indictment, part of this in a paragraph where it talks about a phone call that only Vice President Pence and President Trump were on, very detailed, in which President Trump allegedly says, according to the indictment and according to Vice President Pence, that he is too honest. Now, take that moment in this indictment and put it in politics. The vice president currently is campaigning running against his former boss, and they've just come out with merchandise, hats and T-shirts that say, "Too honest." We're in a different place now. And the courtroom and what happens in all these cases and the rallies versus President Biden, whose approval rating is going down, and President Trump's, who's going up inside the GOP primary.
Yeah, it's a fascinating upside-down world of sorts, and incredible to watch this play out. It's a piece of American history, no matter how you slice it and how you feel about what's going on here. Jonathan Turley, I thought it was interesting. I spoke to former Vice President Pence, current candidate, yesterday. He believes that the president asked him to put the former president, Donald Trump, above the Constitution, and he says that you cannot serve, no one should be president who would do that. You're a constitutional attorney. Did he do that? And if that is the case, do you agree with Mike Pence?
That was a fascinating interview, particularly when you asked how he would vote on the jury, which was quite a question. He said, I'm not sure. The fact is that Pence was right on that day. I criticized President Trump's speech while he was giving it on the air, and also his criticism of Pence. Pence had no choice but to do what he did, and he carried out his constitutional function. The question is whether being wrong means that you are a criminal, and that is what is really at the heart of this indictment. That the indictment is full of references to how the president spread lies, that he spread disinformation, and how so many people told him he was wrong. Well, I was one of them, but he listened to others. He listened to a small group of lawyers who were presenting their own theories about the election. I think they were wrong. I think they've been proven wrong. But the question is it criminal to take that position? That's why the first issue here is going to be a serious
hang on one second. We're just
challenge.
watching all the live things out here. So this is one of the former president's attorneys, Alina Hava. Let's see what she's saying about what's happening.
On March 17th, Hunter accidentally admits that it was his laptop from hell. The next day, DA Alvin Bragg indicts President Trump. June 8th, an FBI document is released showing that the Ukrainians paid the Biden crime family millions and millions of dollars. The next day, the Mar-a-Lago raid and the Mar-a-Lago indictment. Last week, Hunter Biden's sweetheart plea deal fell through when the judge realized it had blanket immunity. The following day, a superseding indictment against Donald Trump. July 31st, Devin Archer goes to testify in front of the House. That was only after they failed to put him in jail prior to the fact. What happens the next day? The January 6th indictment that we're here for today. This is not a coincidence. This is election interference at its finest against the leading candidate right now for president, for either party. President Trump is under siege in a way that we have never seen before. President Trump and his legal team and everyone on his team will continue to fight, not for him, but for the American people. I'll take some questions.
Thank you. I know the president has called this a witch hunt. You just laid out several examples of that. Any other thoughts that the president has communicated to you in terms of why this is going on and then why he calls it a witch hunt?
I think a witch hunt is really the way that anybody should describe this, because it's not something we've seen in our time. This is not even political. This is beyond that. A witch hunt is when you relentlessly attack your opponent, when you relentlessly attack the thing that you are most afraid of. People are afraid of somebody that cannot be bought by Washington. People are afraid of somebody who is independently wealthy and who has given up his good life to fight for this country. And that frightens a lot of politicians who are career politicians, unfortunately, because he'll get back there, and I know he'll be fighting for every one of us so that this doesn't happen to us.
You see, this case is about free speech, but the special counsel says Trump could have disagreed with the results and talked about it. No crime there. The difference is what he did to try and switch the votes.
So what is it that he did to try and switch the votes that you refer to? By bringing cases, by using the law in an appropriate manner, unlike what we're sitting here today seeing. This is not appropriate. What President Trump did is he said, go patriotically and peacefully and protest. That is an American right. That is why we are America, and we are not a third world country. Although I will say that today, I don't feel very much like we are in America. Yes.
This case should go forward before or after the 2024 presidential election?
I think that every court needs to look at this as a whole, right? It's not about the January 6th case. It's about the fact that in the matter of a couple months, we have seen them try and tie up, and me as an attorney, I've never seen this, tie up one individual who's running a campaign, running for office for president, so that he is in court, in depositions, and distracted, so that he won't properly run for 2024. And frankly, it's not going to work.
Is the legal team going to argue that the election was stolen?
I don't think that that's the argument that needs to be made. I think that anybody that believes that is misreading this. The truth is, as an American, there were questions that he had regarding the election integrity. We've seen documents come out, we've seen documentaries come out showing that there were issues with the election. And frankly, by bringing this, I don't think Jack Smith really thought it through. There only has to be proof that, number one, President Trump believed that this election was not completely honest. And number two, Jack Smith has opened himself up to a can of worms that we can now look at and really examine.
If you believe that he's innocent and that this is all a setup, why not bring it to trial as soon as possible before the election so that you can clear his name?
Yeah, I would love to do that, but there's something called discovery. And when somebody wants to say that the 2020 election was perfect and that President Trump has no right to object to it, we've got to go show them all the facts. And there's a lot of facts to show. So everybody has their time. And to say that Donald Trump should then be rushed and not be given the same fair proceeding that anybody else is just, frankly, un-American. It's not fair. It's not the way our system works.
A lot of the lawyers who helped him try to overturn the election are unnamed co-conspirators in the indictment. Jenna Ellis isn't. Why do you think that is?
I'm not going to speak to co-conspirators or anybody else. I represent President Trump.
Let's go one more.
Alina, there are a number of, there's testimony and there's a number of aides that have said that the president was made aware that he lost the election and yet continued to argue that it was stolen from him. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I think that everybody was made aware that he lost the election, but that doesn't mean that that was the only advice he was given. As anybody understands what happens in the Oval Office, there are a numerous amount of advisors and politicians and lawyers, not just one or two, that are giving you advice and telling you what they believe is true. So he may not agree with Mike Pence. He may not agree with one of his lawyers, but that doesn't mean that there weren't other people advising him exactly the opposite. And the president has a right, as every one of us do, to listen to several opinions and make their decision.
I remember hearing Hillary Clinton and Stacey Abrams argue their elections were not right.
Absolutely.
I mean, and the weaponization of the DOJ didn't happen then.
No, of course not. But if your last name's Trump, it's very different. So Hillary Clinton could have a problem when she lost the election, and we could have a complete liberal meltdown, as we all saw. But when we have dignified disagreements, we take them to court. We say do things patriotically and peacefully. He's to blame for things that he did not himself do. And that's what we're seeing. Frankly, folks, this is not about that. This is about politics. This is about 2024. Period. The end.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Alina Habba, attorney for the former president, Donald Trump, answering some questions there. Let's bring our panel back in. Brett, Andy, and Jonathan are still with us. Her argument is interesting, Andy, about them, you know, she says they're basically trying to gum up his entire election cycle by having him in court all the time. Is that, you know, does she make a valid point? And is there a valid argument that this should all go after the election?
Well, I think she not only makes a valid point, Martha, I think it's a finer point than maybe she realizes, because this is not a violent crime case. You know, when you have crimes like that, you're dealing with people who you need to get off the street and in custody. And once you have people in custody, there's pressure to get through the case more quickly so that people's rights aren't violated. This isn't that case. So the government's presentation in all of these different cases, the Justice Department's as well as the ones I think we're going to see from the prosecutor in Atlanta and we've already seen from the prosecutor in Manhattan, these cases would be exactly the same if they weren't tried until, say, December of 2024. In other words, the government would not at all be prejudiced by putting this all off so that the election process, which is constitutionally very important, could work its way through the system. The only reason to act with this haste to boom, 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 get these cases in front of the not only juries but the public on a political calendar is clearly political. And, you know, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but, you know, first of all, Jack Smith, his existence as a special counsel is political. There's no conflict of interest between the Biden Justice Department and Donald Trump. There's a profound conflict of interest between the Biden Justice Department and trying to investigate the Bidens, but Merrick Garland wouldn't appoint a special counsel, which is what you're supposed to do when there's a conflict of interest. Yet he appointed one for Smith. And why did he do that? He did it because Biden and Garland knew that they were going to bring, for example, the case that's in arraignment today, and they didn't want to have their fingerprints on it. They knew that Trump's pitch in the campaign was going to be that Biden was using the Justice Department to persecute him. So they brought Smith in as a political fiction that Biden and Garland don't have anything to do with the prosecution, even though Smith exercises Biden's power and he answers to Garland. So this is political from the get-go, and now they're trying to push it to trial during the election campaign.
I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of this whole thing, whether or not they're going to be able to pull that off, doing this, because we're always hearing, oh, we can't do this, you know, too close to an election, whether it's a judicial appointment discussion or whether it's an investigation with Hillary Clinton and James Comey and all of that. Brett, you know, it's interesting to look at this as well. You know, there's sort of a political line of thought that the Biden team would like to run against President Trump, that he beat him last time. They feel that he's the person who can beat him again. A lot of water under the bridge since then, and now his numbers are going up based on this relentless, whether you think it's accurate or not, it is a relentless pace of prosecution. Do you think that changes their feelings about it?
That's a good question. I think that they still would like to run at the end of the day against the former president. I think they feel President Biden is best positioned there, and there are a lot of variables about the others. But he is strong, not only in the GOP primary, but increasingly strong in the general election. That New York Times Siena poll just out this week had it dead tied, and other polls are tracking that. I just want to go back to that news conference really quickly. You heard Jonathan Swan, I think, asking that question about who was named or believed to be named as co-conspirators. Jenna Ellis, a lawyer who worked on this with former President Trump, was not. Also not in this indictment is former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. And there is a belief that there is, you know, cooperation that is going on here. Jared Kushner is not mentioned in this indictment. And the question is there another shoe to drop here? And is this it? You know, could there be another superseding indictment like we saw in the documents case that comes out after that? We don't know. But what they're trying to focus on is the denial of civil rights of votes based on an 1870 law passed under Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah, great point. Jonathan, you know, when you look at the connection that needs to be made here, and you know, Brett raises a good point about who else might have material to bring into this. We've only seen the indictment. We haven't seen the full case, and perhaps some of those people are involved. But the link that has to be drawn on this criminal indictment is between, you know, saying that you don't believe the outcome of the election, and then linking that to the action of conspiracy. So you have to link it. And we don't have an incitement charge in here. We don't have a seditious conspiracy charge in here. That, you know, what we saw from the Oath Keepers and all of that was orchestrated from Trump or anyone at the White House. That link has not been made in this indictment.
That's right. That's the most glaring omission, is that if you recall, the second impeachment was based on the argument of various Democrats like Adam Schiff and others that it was established that the president was guilty of incitement, of seditious conspiracy, and these other crimes. They're not in this. You would think they were, from what Smith said in his press conference. He talked as if Trump was being indicted for the attack on the Capitol. He's not. He's being indicted for spreading lies. That's what the indictment says over and over again, and they insist that he knew they were lies. Now, note, the Justice Department says that he's constitutionally protected in making false statements, but not if he didn't think that they were true. Well, that gets back to Brett's statement. You know, do they have someone like Mark Meadows or someone else who's going to say, you know what, he told me that this was all one big scam? You know, Trump, from all the accounts, seemed to be on message consistently that, and many people believe that he does believe this. But the question for, I think, the courts, particularly appellate courts, is going to be, is this what we want to have in the criminal code? Do we want the federal government to be able to arrest politicians and say, yeah, you can say false things, but not when you know they're false, and you should have listened to us? That's a dangerous road to go down. And I think that when you also look at what was raised earlier about the nature of these counts, I think that that 19th century law involving the denial of voting rights is very sketchy in terms of its legal use here. But they still have to face the First Amendment questions. I think a lot of judges are going to be highly skeptical about this indictment. Keep in mind, Martha, if you believe that the president may have believed this all along, like many people have said he does, this entire case collapses. Now, this is why, by the way, I'm not so sure Trump wouldn't have invited this one case. Like, he has a lot to worry about in Florida. But this case may be just ready for order for Trump. I think a lot of Americans view this as they did the New York case, that Smith may have jumped the shark here. He may have left a lot of the public behind. And, you know, I think you're going to see that play out in the coming days.
Yeah, you know, just to put a fine point on it, you have to make, if you can prove, I know it's so circular, but if you can prove that he knew that he lost the election, then you're creating intent, correct? Intent to deceive, that's right, and that's a conspiracy, I guess. It's pretty it's pretty tough.
Yeah, I mean, there's two breaking linchpins here. First, in the Alvarez case, the Supreme Court dealt with a politician who knowingly lied. And the court still said that that was protected. But more importantly, you then have the linchpin to these later steps, third parties taking steps to create a second set of electors, and whether he's responsible for those actions. That's why this is really attenuated, in my view. And each of these linchpins has got to hold for Smith to be able to bring this to a jury.
Okay. Jonathan, thank you very much. Great to have you with us. Let's bring back in Neil Cavuto, anchor of Your World, Dana Perino, former White House press secretary, America's Newsroom co-anchor, co-host of The Five, and Shannon Bream, Fox News Sunday anchor and chief legal correspondent. Great to have all of you with us. I just want to start by giving you a little bit of color from what's going on in the courthouse. This is coming to us from Jake Gibson, our reporter on the ground there, producer on the ground there. So basically, we understand that that the former president will gaggle on the tarmac at DCA, which is Reagan National Airport, once the motorcade arrives there. So we're learning that the statement that he's going to make will be right after this when we watch the motorcade go, and we'll obviously cover all of that. They're in the media room right now. They can see the courtroom. Special counsel Jack Smith has entered the courtroom and is sitting down in the front row. Former President Trump has not entered the courtroom yet. So we're keeping close eye on that. Molly Gaston, special counsel's team, sitting at the prosecutor's table as well. And sources familiar with Fox Digital say that the former president will plead not guilty to all counts. No big surprise there, Neil. Your thoughts on where we are at 3:50 Eastern time today?
Well, you know, I'm no lawyer, but I have watched enough episodes of Law & Order to, I think, qualify. One thing I notice that's fascinating, Martha, is this indictment is really just charging Donald Trump. It's just him, just him. They talk about these 6 co-conspirators, but they're not part of this process today, which gets back to this notion that maybe this is the case that Jack Smith wants to have the best chance of expediting, getting it moving quickly. Unlike the Mar-a-Lago case with the documents, there are a lot of national security and other issues that could rightly delay key portions, if not push it well into the year after next, let alone next year. But with this case, keeping it simple, keeping it focused on him, keeping it focused on his motives, keeping it focused on where he was coming from, or whether he knew in his heart of hearts that this challenge of the election was not backed up by the facts, that this was and is meant to be expedited. You have a judge involved in this case, an Obama-appointed judge, who has a record of moving with great alacrity and also severity. She has meted out big punishments for those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. In fact, in 9 of those cases, exceeding the jail time the prosecutors were recommending. So I put all that together in my legal head, born of Law and Order episodes, to think, I know the real lawyers here are saying this guy is beyond, beyond. But I'm just thinking that this is the emphasis here. Right. Let me clear the decks to get this clearly done quickly.
All right, let's go to the lawyers. Shannon, what do you think?
Yeah, this case is much more streamlined than the Mar-a-Lago case with the documents. We've talked about this a little bit. That one is going to be very involved because there will be all kinds of challenges to the classified documents, getting things vetted, what can jurors see. The pretrial motions feel like they'll take longer with that. Neil rightly points out this judge is probably not going to have a lot of tolerance for a lot of pretrial motions if she feels they're strictly about delaying. One of the things you've got to imagine President Trump's team is going to ask for is change of venue. Dana and I know, living many years in Washington, D.C., it is not Trump country. It is a place that voted 92% in the 2020 election for President Biden. His team's going to argue he can't get an unpolitically biased jury there. That's going to be one of the things that will potentially try to slow down this trial for them. But they know they're going into hostile territory with this particular case, but it's much smaller, much more streamlined than that Mar-a-Lago case. So it does have a chance of going earlier. But there is so much that happens before a huge federal case. You've already heard President Trump's attorney, John Morrow, out there, Lauro, saying it took them years to put together this case. As Dana pointed out, it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of stuff we didn't know about before. But he says, you know, we need a lot of time to put together our defense, too.
Yeah. You know, Dana, I'm thinking back to prior elections, and I'm thinking about some of the things that Hillary Clinton said about President Trump. You know, he knows he's an illegitimate president. She said the argument was that the Russians had interfered in social media, that they had been able to sort of infiltrate people's thought process in a lot of ways, and a lot of other tangents to the case that they were making. You think of Stacey Abrams losing the governor's race in Georgia. Took her, I think, over a year, at least over a year, to concede that she had lost that race to Brian Kemp. She said that they were suppressing the vote, despite the fact that more people voted than had voted in prior elections. So I guess some people look at those situations and say, what's the difference?
Yeah, under this standard, would they have been charged as well? Would the Republican candidate for governor of Arizona in 2022 be charged right now? That is, to me, a good question. And that's why this, I guess I hope that there is more legal clarity about what they're doing. One thing that's interesting is we talk about the venue, whether should it be in D.C. or would he be able to maybe take it to West Virginia, as his lawyer, John Lauro, has suggested. I doubt they're going to allow that, but it's an interesting thing to think about, like, should they? But there is a court where the jury is already seated, and that is the court of public opinion. And before I went to the White House, I spent about a year as a spokesperson at the Department of Justice. And I am pretty amazed that they're going to bring a case against the former president of the United States and lose, in my opinion, lose every news cycle from that moment. What has happened today? You had President Trump leading the news once again. You have 8 other candidates wanting to run against him for the primary, for the Republican nomination. They can't get on air because why? We're all going to talk about this because this is so unprecedented. Also, what does he do? He puts out a Truth Social post. He says, I am going up there. I'm going to get arrested for you. You've pointed this out, Martha. And that resonates with his voters, of which they are so durable. His lead is there and it is strong, and the rest of the candidates are thinking, what can I possibly do? So the court of public opinion is well out there. And then you have his lawyer, Alina Habba, who's willing to take several questions from the press. You don't have the Justice Department doing that. You don't have cameras in the courtroom today where Jack Smith could answer some questions. They are allowing the Trump team to absolutely dominate the news cycles. Even if the other media isn't covering this on the network news, that's not where the majority of people are getting their news anymore. They're getting it online on their phones. Hopefully they're getting it here, but they're getting it on podcasts. But President Trump is giving the press something to at least talk about and to question the Justice Department. So I hate it when people lose news cycles if they're supposed to win them. And I just look at this and think professionally, it's a little bit shocking to me that the Justice Department is leaving so much on the ground.
Yeah, it's a great point. Neil, politically, you've interviewed a lot of these candidates. We've all spoken to them, and we'll be speaking to them more as we move forward. But they really cannot get any oxygen. They can't break through this news cycle. And I would imagine that the former president doesn't love the fingerprinting part of this, but the rest of it, he no doubt is very shrewd about understanding the impact and the platform that he has.
Sucking all the oxygen out of the room. But, you know, it is interesting here. If you look at all these indictments put together, the three now, we're looking at 78 different charges. Right. You know, some of those carry substantial jail time. They found guilty on them. Of course, if you put them all together, it's 650 years behind prison. But my only point in mentioning that is a conviction on anything could change the game here. I know there was a Reuters poll not too long ago. I don't know what polls we're able to quote and all, so I apologize. But I think the sentiment expressed there is that such a development, a conviction for the former president, would turn off a lot of those same Republican voters who are rallying to him. Not all of them. I think it was close to half. That might change their sentiment now. And that's the irony of you know, a pending trial, let's say, if we get into March or April or May of next year, by which time you could have conceivably, given his lead in the polls right now, Donald Trump acquiring all the delegates he needs to be the Republican presidential nominee. Now, that is something we can't fathom. But again, I think given all these counts, the possibility of going 78-0 and swapping them down, that's a tough road to hoe. So that is something that could change everything. The improving poll numbers, all of that. If a conviction comes forward, you could still serve and all that. There are a lot of people, though, who might say, no, this is a bridge too far.
Yeah,
I don't know.
You know, I feel, Shannon, I feel like I've heard that it's going to be a bridge too far with the 45th president going all the way back to the Access Hollywood tape, you know, before he was elected the first time. I think that he's politically just different and appeals to people, his voters, in a different way. And the rules are different when it comes to this president as you look at history and what you would have expected along the way. But people have said recently, well, if there's more than this first indictment, well, that might be the deal breaker. And if there's another one, well, here we are. And we're not seeing any change. But do you think Neil is right? I mean, would a conviction sit differently with American voters or not?
It might, but it might, that base that is for him, be even more emboldened to say, you know, and prove, like, we got to vote this guy in. We got to save him because he's been convicted. Remember, if federal charges, he could conceivably pardon himself if convicted and became president. We've got state charges he's got to deal with, too. And now we're standing by any day for word out of Georgia and the special grand jury there. That would be a whole new headache for this team on an already very full plate.
Yeah. The drama is continuous. Quick thought, Dana, before we toss over to Neil?
Well, I think that as I mentioned, the news cycle, I think the Trump team's winning that news cycle today, and I expect that to continue into tonight.
All right. We will see Dana. Thank you very much, Shannon. Great to see you. We'll see Dana later at 5 o'clock. We'll see Shannon on Sunday, and I think later here as well. And now our live coverage continues as Neil takes over his hour. Hi, Neil.
All right. Thank you very much, Martha. Don't go too far because I have a lot of questions to ask you and Brett and Andy and John, you in a little bit. But as you just indicated here, we're waiting to see how this all sorts out today. The former president of the United States is facing his third arrest or arraignment, however you want to describe it, in the last 4 months. This is supposed to be the case that would be the most expedited, or at least deemed to be the one that the main prosecutor here thinks could really cinch his case and cinch what he wants to see happen, and that is eventually make sure that Donald Trump never can be president of the United States again. But again, that wasn't the perceived goal here, but that is the perception among a lot of Donald Trump supporters who think that this has gone too far. Let's get the latest right now from Griff Jenkins. He's at the U.S. District Court in Washington, where all of this is going down.
That's right, Neil. Good afternoon. And Fox can confirm that former President Trump is indeed in the courtroom right now. He entered at about 3:52 p.m., so just under 10 minutes ago. He's wearing a blue suit, a red tie. He was flanked by his two attorneys, Todd Blanche and John Lauro. And Fox has confirmed that we expect him to plead not guilty to the 4 felony charges he's facing in this indictment. 3 are obstruction charges, 3 are conspiracy charges. 1 is obstruction. Now, before he entered that courtroom, a little less than an hour ago, his motorcade entered the garage here at the federal courthouse, and he was processed, so he was fingerprinted. There was no mugshot taken because the court says there's plenty of pictures of him to provide. He's not actually arrested, but he is obviously being processed. Now we wait for this court proceeding to get underway. At the time of our note from our producer, Jay Gibson, inside, the magistrate judge had not entered the courtroom. He'll go before a magistrate judge today, but the judge who will preside over this trial, a judge named Tanya Chutkan, 2014 Obama appointee, is different. She comes later. Meanwhile, before the former president entered the courthouse, but after he'd gone in the courthouse but not gone into court itself, Trump's illegal spokesperson, Alina Habba, came out and did a short gaggle with the press, Neil, and she said, among other things, that the former president is under siege like never before, saying that this is election interference at its finest against the leading candidate. She also took time to point to, as we have documented, the sort of pattern of news that relates to, say, Hunter Biden, and then the next day there's something pertaining to Trump's legal woes. It lasted about 10 minutes. She took about 4 or 5 questions. That's where things are now. Now, outside the courtroom, the scene is one of high security, a lot of media, and a handful of supporters, many for former President Trump, and some protesters against him. Right now, it's all eyes waiting to see what happened. And just to give a little lay of the land for viewers who are maybe joining us, overshadowing this whole proceeding is, of course, the U.S. Capitol, just a few blocks down the street, a short walking distance, where the January 6th riots took place, and, of course, the crux of what Special Counsel Jack Smith, who also is in the courtroom at this time, is trying to tie the former president to. That's the situation out here. Neil, we're keeping an eye on it, watching for any developments. We'll bring them to you as we get them.
Just to clarify, I know Martha touched on this in the last hour, Griff. We're not expecting any statement from the former president there at the court site, maybe at the airport, but not there.
Well, we don't know. Remember, if you go back to June, when I was down covering the arraignment there, when he was dealing with the documents case, the former president left and went to a Cuban restaurant. It was very accessible to the press. We don't know exactly what he's going to do, but we certainly have no expectation he's going to walk out and talk to us here. Our understanding is that that spokesperson, Alina Habba, that gave us a little gaggle, may be all we get here at the court. But you never know. The former president has often surprised us. We'll see what happens.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Griff. Again, this is the 3rd time we've seen something like this in the last 4 months, and there could be more to come. Of course, we've been telling you a lot about that Georgia case involving the president's role, the former president's role in the Georgia recount case. The Fulton County prosecutor's already indicated that she was ready to go. We don't know what she meant by that, whether that was like now, next week, the week after that. But let me bring in our esteemed panel to cover this in greater detail. Martha MacCallum back with us, anchor of The Story, executive editor of The Story with Martha MacCallum. Her co-debate moderator is joining us as well, Brett Baer, anchor of Special Report, chief political anchor, executive editor, snappy, snazzy dresser always. Andy McCarthy is here as well. He knows something about the legal process. Probably not as much as me with my L.A. law background and law and order, but he's very close. John Yoo as well. John, of course, the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Martha, I started with you. I'd like to get your take then on what's at stake here, because much has been said of the judge not handling this particular arraignment today, but will be handling this case, this Obama appointee. And Tanya Chutkan doesn't suffer fools gladly, or at least those who precipitated what she called an historic event. And I'm just wondering if she's been tough on those who were involved on the storming of the Capitol on January 6th and meting out sentences that went even beyond what some of the prosecutors were asking, will she be tough on the guy they were answering to?
Yeah, could be. You know, I think, as Jessica Tarlov pointed out a little while ago, the take was that in Florida, he has a judge who might be more favorable to him because he appointed her. In this case, it might be, the perception at least might be that it could go in a different direction. And when it comes to change of venue issues or the pace of this trial, she's known for having a speedy pace with these other January 6th situations. So she may be cut to the chase kind of judge on this. It's interesting. She's not there today. It was a magistrate who handled this case, but we got a little bit of color from Jake Gibson about what it's like in there. According to him, our producer on the ground for the Department of Justice, he said that the president was stoic when he entered the room. Remember that when he enters the room, he has just come from the processing phase of all of this, the fingerprinting, which it has to be a difficult experience for anybody going through that, no matter how much you may feel that you're sort of fighting for the people, as he has said in his Truth Social post. That can't be that pleasant an experience. That he looked around the room, signed some more papers at the desk. He's about 20 feet from Jack Smith in this room. Obviously, somebody that, he's not going to want to go over and glad hand. And he's, obviously said a lot of things about him. So this is a tense situation. Even though it's the third time that we've watched this, there's no doubt that it's a very tense situation, but it's one that the former president is clearly trying to leverage as best he can politically.
Brett, you've talked to the president. I think of the first time we were watching all of this with the Alvin Bragg counts that came up in New York. I'm not saying that the former president looked flustered, but you could tell that this was an overwhelming first time in my life experience kind of thing. This is the third time. It might not be the last time. How do you think he is comporting himself? You've had a chance to see him up close in that interview. I know it takes it case by case. I know the bravado and everything associated with it. But how is he dealing with this from what you can see?
Yeah, Neil, good afternoon. First of all, I think this is all surreal. The fact that Griff Jenkins, our correspondent out there, references that other arraignment that he covered with the former president. Right. We're on our third one here, and this is pretty amazing as we talk about this. I think the president, you're right, for all the bravado on Truth Social, all the things he says, I think that those images, and when we had a glimpse in Manhattan of his face, are someone who does take this seriously. He's facing a lot of time in jail if he was convicted of all these things. He doesn't believe he's going to be. He believes he's going to fight it all. And I think the bravado is real, but at moments he thinks about the seriousness of what he's looking at. That judge is Judge Chutkan. In these cases, she first ruled on the access by the January 6th committee to all of the White House files and all of the background information. And in making that ruling, she said from the bench, the president is not king, and he's no longer president. And she's, in a number of these cases about January 6th rioters, it made clear her disdain, obviously, for that day, that moment, and what it means for democracy. In that context, I think she's probably going to hold the reins pretty tight in this courtroom.
So does that mean, and by that, Andy, from what Brett said, that obviously the Trump folks are going to want to push this back and punt it back as far as they possibly can? She might not abide that. Can she force that issue to say, I know what you want, but here's what I'm going to do? End of story.
I think she has a very hard time doing that here, Neil. And this is because of a tactical move that Smith made, which I think he may end up regretting. And that is, if you really want to get this case to trial quickly, you indict this one first. And instead, what he did was he indicted the Florida case first. And that gives former President Trump the ability to come into Judge Chutkan's court and say, he tactically undermined my due process right to prepare a defense in this trial by choosing not only to indict me in another district, but to persuade the judge in that district to get the case to trial in May. So it's very hard for him, I think, at this point to then say, and we need to get this case to trial very quickly. Now, she may be very open to that argument, but he has made himself a kind of a minefield in terms of doing that. I would just also say about this case, to a point that Brett made before, for what it's worth, when I had indictments where I had co-conspirators or accomplice witnesses, I like to put them in the indictment. I know there's a lot of speculation now about people whose names are not in the indictment. Typically, when you have people who are cooperating with the government, you want that in the indictment. You want to describe it. You want to describe who they are. They help you, in some ways, make the allegations that you put into the indictment, and that goes back to the jury when they're deliberating over the case. So that's the kind of thing that I'd be surprised if he's leaning heavily on people who aren't mentioned in the indictment one way or the other.
You know, John, we learned, and I think Martha was touching on it, and Brett indirectly, that the president is now, the former president is in the room. Jack Smith is in the room. Donald Trump, you know, we're told, kept looking at him, or no, not kept, but was looking at him. And I'm wondering how you can explain this sort of stage setting here. It almost comes across to me like the stare off before a prize fight, you know, where they're staring at each other and looking at each other, weighing the other. I'm not going to do my Mr. T impression. I'll save you that. But I am wondering, John, what to make of that. What do you look for? You know, you're a good lawyer. You're looking back and forth, how people are sort of sizing each other up. The president, obviously, no fan of Jack Smith. It's pretty clear from the remarks and the statements that we've heard out of Jack Smith, neither he of the former president, but play that kind of drama behind the scenes out. It's probably more body language than anything else. But what do you think?
You know, it's a great question. I've never told you this, but I actually worked in that courthouse for more than a year. I was a clerk for one of the great D.C. Circuit judges. We're very aware of the historic importance of that courtroom. That is the courtroom where President Truman was stopped from seizing the steel mills. That is the courtroom where President Nixon was ordered to hand over the Watergate tapes case. So it's almost fitting that I think the most important criminal trial in the history of our country is going to take place in the D.C. courthouse. It is on a par with those earlier decisions, those earlier cases that mean so much to the Constitution and our political system. It's actually not a very big courtroom. It looks like a lot of the other ones. It's mahogany, and the judge is way up there on a dais. But as you say, Neil, the prosecution and the defense sit very close to each other. They're probably less than 2 feet apart, and they're going to be looking at each other the whole trial. Actually, one of the interesting questions, despite the historic significance of this, is President Trump going to show up for every day and every minute of the proceedings? He has the constitutional right to do so. We want the jury to see him. We have the belief in our system that when you put witnesses up on the trial, they should be confronted by the defendant so we can tell who's lying and who's not. But President Trump, as you've said before, has to conduct a re-election campaign. Is he going to be there every day for the trial when he's supposed to be out of caucuses and primaries? That underscores, again, the unprecedented nature of this case. The last thing I just want to add is, even though this is the most important, I think, criminal trial we've had in our history, even though the stakes are so high, I would have liked the Justice Department to present a watertight case on the facts and on the law. And in fact, I think what you're going to see in this courtroom, and what Donald Trump's going to see as a defendant, is a prosecution that's got to really press imaginative, unprecedented theories about the crimes and has to fill some holes in the facts, since they could never make the direct connection between Donald Trump and the January 6 rioters. One other thing about the placement of the courtroom in the courthouse is that the January 6 rioters, on their way from the White House and the Ellipse to the Capitol that day, would have marched right in front of that courthouse. I would have had an office. I used to look right out on the path that they were taking that day.
So, by the way, you were referring to this case today, not the prior cases, that when you said about a tighter or more buttoned-up case, this case today, right?
Yes, yes.
Got it. All right, guys, don't wander too far. I know I'll be talking to you a little later. For those of you just joining and watching right now, this historic moment, the third time, to Brett Baer's point, we're seeing this, so we are getting used to it. Maybe the former president is getting used to it. But again, it is scary stuff for him with these latest charges, 4 more, 78 charges that carry a lot of years, centuries in prison if found guilty on all. Of course, that is not likely to be the case, of course. But again, the weight of this and the sheer number of these charges just continue to pile up, and we might not be done here. I want to bring in a new panel here. Shannon Bream, of course, anchor Fox News Sunday, our chief legal correspondent. We got Dana Perino with us as well. Dana, of course, America's Newsroom. She's co-host of The Fight. She does a lot of things. Jonathan Turley, George Washington University law professor, Fox News contributor. Shannon, I did want to go back to what happens next. You have to be cognizant of the fact that if you're the judge here, that the guy whose case you're sort of overseeing is running for President of the United States. He can't be in this courtroom every day once proceedings begin, and he's not too keen on being in that courtroom in that city anyway. But what are your thoughts on that and where this likely goes, the timetable of it?
So think about the fight that we saw over the timetable with the Mar-a-Lago documents case down in Florida. There was pushback on scheduling. The DOJ wanted that in December. President Trump's legal team said absolutely not. There are all these other things that are going to happen. It's not going to work. Well, remember, the judge pushed it into May, but she did respond to some of the statements there about the fact that he's running for president. She said a lot of people have very demanding jobs and still they are charged with crimes and they proceed through the criminal system. So that's the judge that most people want to say, oh, she was appointed by Trump, she's friendly to Trump. That's going to be the easier court for him. So you think about how these things will play with this judge in D.C., who has been tough on this president before, has been tough on the January 6th defendants, and is probably going to look askance at things like pushing for venue change and other things that will slow this down. But to this moment in history, I have to say there's been a guy standing out in front of the courtroom with a huge sign that says coup. And I'm thinking to myself, is he there to call out President Trump for what he thinks was an attempted coup, or is that sign for the DOJ? I mean, that's where this country is right now, trying to figure out how divided we are and how people can see two sides of this legal fight so differently.
Yeah, it is true. And we know on the impact on the former president is that's been favorable politically, Dana, and we haven't seen polls since a lot of this has developed here, and I would imagine that is going to continue that trend. So he's got a lock right now, not only on all the attention and oxygen in the room, but the support. Many people who don't flip over him personally, or maybe didn't like the way he was acting or behaving or talking about some of his other presidential candidates. But the fact of the matter is, his support is almost like a vice-like grip on the party right now, and it's helping him politically, regardless of where it takes him legally. What do you make of that?
Well, I feel like with his commanding poll numbers that it's like one giant leap for a presidential candidate. I mean, it's so far ahead and it's so durable that it's super interesting to see how the Democrats have believed that the more they file lawsuits against him or bring indictments, that for sure now, of course, they believe that the Republicans are going to walk away from President Trump. I don't know how many times they have to try to learn this lesson, but it doesn't hurt him. It has shown to help him. And I think one of the things is, Neil, that you can believe that January 6th was an abhorrent situation and that even that the White House acted in a disgraceful manner, and still think, like what John, you just said, is that this case is not airtight. And that makes it even more difficult for people who would want to say, look, it's time to turn the page on President Trump. And then you have some people saying, you know, I've got some sympathy for the guy. Because are they going to come after my thoughts next? Let's just say I was a climate denier. I'm not, but let's just say I am. Am I next? I mean, who gets to decide who is telling the truth? And so now we're back to that. I think that is a very interesting situation to be in. The other thing I would point out is that President Trump is winning this news cycle, and he will continue to. I know that he's probably having a miserable time in there waiting for this to be over so that he can get back home. But they should know, and I think that he says this in his Truth Social post, like he truly believes there is great support for him on this matter. The last thing I would point out is on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. So you go down, there's the White House, and then you go across. and you go to the State Department. I would imagine that the State Department today probably called 3 countries around the world and urged them not to prosecute their political opponents. Guarantee it. I mean, because it happens all the time. This is what the United States does. We are the leader of the free world. We try to remind people, no, we have peaceful transitions of power. Let the people decide. Let the people be governed by who they choose. And I think that that message gets much harder to deliver when you have a situation like this. If John Yoo was right, like if the case was super airtight and you had a phone call with a video where President Trump is saying, go to the Capitol and attack these police officers, that would be a different story. But that is not what the Justice Department came forward with on this one.
All right, but still, if you think about it, Dana, over the course of this time with these 78 charges, some are pretty severe. Some can be swatted away, I guess. But the fact of the matter is we wouldn't be in this position. Again, the pylon notwithstanding, you're quite right to raise the political implications of that and the timing of it by all means. But he's charged with doing a lot of awful things. And you know, they might not be 78 instances of that are legit, but there are enough to give people pause. Even his most diehard fans, if they were to sort of, you know, surgically take apart what's been debated here, you know, from going back to saying you didn't have documents when you did, you didn't move them when in fact you did, you didn't deny their existence or the fact that they might have been on other people's hands when that was indeed the case. And I could go on, payments made allegedly.
I think that case was very different.
But I hear you on all of the above. I'm just saying, though, that this is all part of a greater pattern of behavior, the prosecutor is going to say, combining all of these, that shows where there's smoke, there is at least some fire. Do you think that resonates, or at this time, no?
Well, I think that, again, like if anything in the indictment that the Justice Department put forward in this particular case today that we're talking about in regards to January 6th had been different than anything I had already read about on the front pages of all the newspapers and reported on here myself, then I think I would have been looking at this in a different way. But I just look at this and I think we've been talking about, we knew all of this. They didn't have anything new. In the documents case, that was new and that was different. And they do have President Trump saying directly that he shouldn't have had the documents. And now he swatted that away, calling it hyperbole, etc. But I do think that that case was very, very different. And if I was the spokesperson at DOJ again, and I was looking at the documents case versus this one, I have to say from a messaging standpoint, if you want to win this in the court of public opinion before the 2024 election, the Justice Department in this case is falling short.
Interesting. All right, Jonathan Turley, let me pursue that with you then, because, you know, this, you know, some people have said, and some lawyers have said, maybe chatting to you, this is the weakest T of the cases as far as prosecutors are concerned and going after Donald Trump, that you're trying to attach him for cause and effect and a quid pro quo to inciting words, to inciting violence, to, well, what we saw on January 6th. I had even a Democratic congressman on the other day, Jonathan, who was trying to argue about the 14th Amendment, and that alone, you know, which shows you can't hold office if they've engaged in an insurrection or rebellion. They're going and bending over backwards to say he caused an insurrection or rebellion. And the reason why that's important to a lot of Democrats is that that would disqualify him from being president of the United States. That's the leap they're taking. What do you think of that train of thought and that leap? Because that's not the connection that's going on here in this case.
No, and it's really approaching the urban legend status because he's not charged with incitement. He's not charged with insurrection. He's not charged with seditious conspiracy. He's not charged with all of those things the Democrats impeached him on the second time. So they're really big-footing the Constitution here. It's not there, but the question is, what is here? And I have to tell you, this is pretty thin soup in my view. They have a colossal constitutional problem that they will have to overcome from the outset. They have to establish all of these linchpins, that he not only believed that the truth of the matter, that he understood he was lying, but then he played a criminal role in getting these other individuals to take the steps mentioned in the indictment. That is a very difficult case to prove. And I think part of the dynamic that we're seeing is that you can't just, pursue a president from pillar to post across the country without people beginning to tune out. I mean, look, this day would be called a life-changing experience for most people. For Donald Trump, it's called Thursday. I mean, he is, this is his third indictment. He's going to likely get a fourth indictment. And the real jury in this case is likely the one that will be voting for 2024. And I think we're already seeing how this is impacting them. But I have to tell you, in this case, I should think that Trump would welcome aspects of this case precisely because of that issue, and also because he has these threshold legal questions that he should be able to get to the appellate courts fairly quickly. So Smith has to be careful what he's asking for. The Trump team might give it to him. It's unlikely he'll get a trial put in front of the Florida trial, but they could very well help him out in moving these issues to the appellate court and asking them, is this the criminalization of disinformation? Are you about to criminalize false political speech? Because in the past, the Supreme Court has been extremely skeptical of laws that attempt to do that.
Interesting. By the way, as expected, Shannon Bream, if you're still with I see you are. The former president, has pled not guilty. He was stood and sworn in at about 4:15 p.m., so about 15 minutes ago. The magistrate, the judge, is separate from the judge who will ultimately be providing over this case, Maxilla Odupta. She said, I'll advise you of the counts and penalties, and then it goes through the counts and penalties. The former president confirms his name and age, and then she goes through the various counts, the conspiracy to defraud the U.S., a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, violating official proceedings, conspiracy rights, adds them all up. Their fines, dollars, and jail, and all of such. And he stands, I guess, to hear all of that. How is that meted out then? In other words, after he pleads not guilty, which is fully expected, but the judge clearly wants to remind him of what's at stake with each of these counts. That's the procedure, correct?
It is. You want the individual, before they make a plea, to know exactly what they're up against, what they are charged with, and make sure they have the full understanding of what's going on. Again, pleading not guilty is what we always expect from this president. He said it publicly, he said it privately, and then he proceeds on to that wait to see what happens in Georgia. This is a different proceeding today. Yes, he is processed. Yes, there are fingerprints, but there's no mugshot. You have the Fulton County Sheriff down in Georgia saying, if he gets charged down here, which we're standing by within the next couple of weeks, we think would be the window, you're going to get a mugshot down here in Georgia. That is going to be, as much as Dana said, he's got to be uncomfortable in this proceeding today. It's a place where he's powerless, basically sitting in the courtroom, to have to go through what many criminal defendants, people facing allegations have to do and get a criminal mugshot would be something that would be very unpleasant for this president, former president, to have to do down in Georgia. But he's at the mercy of that proceeding as we now wait to see how that happens. He was kind of flippantly, on social media earlier today saying one more indictment and then that ensures my reelection. He knows there's possibly another one coming. So, he's joking about a fourth one. And while it does help him politically, we always say in the fundraising, in the polls, it feeds into his argument. I'm here for you. They're coming through me to try to get to you. I'm here fighting for you. All of us know the real gravity, and he most certainly does too, about the legal charges and what they mean in the long term, or maybe in the short term for him. We've had that timeline up all today about the state trials that he's facing, the federal trials that will come as well. And as you've mentioned earlier today, these include potentially, upon conviction, decades in jail. They include fines that would not be of worry to, most criminal defendants in his position. It's really the time behind bars. But I do think appeals, as Professor Twirly mentions, all of those things are going to, they're going to impact how this plays out, the timing of it, how the election is involved, and where we go from here. So this is a president who I think very much enjoys on the stage being able to take on this fight. He is a fighter. He enjoys the back and forth. But when you're sitting in that courtroom at the mercy of that judge and that prosecutor, it's a very different feeling.
Yeah, I can't help but thinking, too, Dana Perino, if you're still with me, and I'm thinking the big debate coming up, and I'm not saying this to sell the debate. I know this is a great debate, and it'd be great if the president, all the candidates who could make it, were making it. But I'm thinking if you're Donald Trump, and this is all everyone's talking about, and you own all the oxygen in the room, wouldn't you want to be in that room? You've already handicapped all your opponents from saying anything bad about you, even though some have. They've gotten a little return on the buck for that. And you don't want to give them free rein, you know, in Milwaukee to say even more when you can be there and put them all on. What do you think, though, I've been treated fairly or not? I could just see how he could play off of that, but what do you think?
Well, I said something very similar on Tuesday when the breaking news came that the indictment was being handed down, that after you think about it for a moment, if I were the former president and I was up against these other candidates and I have this durable lead, I would like to be there on stage with them, because obviously this is a topic that's going to come up, and look each of them in the eye and say, don't you agree that this is wrong, that I have been wronged, and get them all on camera in front of him, make them look him in the eye and say it. I would definitely want to be there. Because I could imagine a Chris Christie said, I don't think it's wrong at all. He might. You built this for yourself, not us. But he and maybe, you know, former Congressman Hurd, if he makes the cut, you're not going to see a lot of them doing that, right? But and maybe Vice President Pence. He is not qualified for the debate yet, but he has been quite vocal and a little bit more assertive in the last 48 hours. And you saw that on the story with Martha McCallum. Go ahead.
Although there is a one wrinkle here that could come in, Neil, and that is, you know, I doubt that the Trump team can get a change of venue in this case. Arguing that the jurisdiction is politically disadvantageous is just not a very good basis to change the court location. But the judge could do some other things that could impact the debate and other things. In D.C., they tend to impose gag orders on defendants. They tend to be a little more aggressive in that sense than some courts. The question is whether this judge, who's viewed as a very tough judge, is going to say, you know what, I'm going to treat you like any other defendant. I don't want you talking about the case in public. Now, I think, by the way, that would be a serious mistake for the judge. I think that it would be taken up on appeal, and I hope it would be reversed. But she could impose that type of order, and that can impact his appearances at the debate or on the campaign trail.
Which might make him want to do it all the more.
Well, you just read my mind. I mean,
that's true. Yes.
You know, I guess the judge in this case today kind of read the expected riot act and talked to Donald Trump as well as his lawyers to say you can't violate fed, state, or local law while you're on release. In other words, they're going to let him out. You must appear in court, must serve sentence that the court may impose. Defendant may not communicate about the facts of the case to anyone known to be a witness in the case, and then reminding him, Mr. Trump, please listen carefully to these warnings that I give all defendants. If you fail to comply, a warrant may be issued for your arrest. That's what they do, Shannon, but it's powerful when you hear it from a judge talking to a man who was and wants to be again President of the United States.
Yeah, there are real penalties for not doing what a judge has ordered you to do or a court has ordered you to do. It does put you in a much different position no matter how powerful that you are. I asked one of the president's previous attorneys who was still representing him at the time, meaning President Trump, what would you do with a gag order? And he thought it was preposterous. He said, I can't imagine somebody that's running for president would be asked to comply with this. But you guys make great points, because every one of his rallies is about this. Every one of his speeches, every one of his appearances, every one of his fundraising emails. I mean, they're all about this. So, I mean, a judge could really tie his hands if they tried to enact a gag order in a case like this, because it is what he talks about nonstop on the stump. It resonates with people. It has built him a lead in fundraising and in support. And I can't imagine that there wouldn't be serious legal fights and wrangling and appeals over that point if that was an attempt.
All right, guys, I want to thank you very, very much. As expected, again, for those of you just tuning in, Donald Trump is not guilty on all 4 January 6th charges here. I want to go to Griff Jenkins, who's outside the U.S. District Court in Washington. Well, all this is going down. Griff.
Well, Neil, you know, we are waiting here with all the crowds and the media for the former president to leave now that we do know he's pled not guilty. And you were reading, Neil, the terms of his release. It's fascinating. The very last thing that the magistrate judge said to him was, quote, you may also face a longer sentence for having committed a crime. That stands out to me because as this, not this magistrate judge, but the actual judge, Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is going to preside over his trial, is known for giving giving harsh sentence to upwards of almost 40 cases involving January 6th riot defendants prior to this trial. So an interesting note, just to add a little bit of color in what's happening here. But, you know, you were talking just a moment ago, Neil, about the amount of media attention that Donald Trump is getting compared to his rivals. Let me just spin the camera a little dirty behind the scenes look for your viewers, Neil, and you can see as far as the eye, cameras and media. There are hundreds of cameras out here. Media, it goes all the way around the block, and then also to my left as well, media and cameras from all over the world. And really that is, I think, perhaps what Team Trump is trying to capitalize on. That's why we saw Alina Habba, his legal spokeswoman, stand out in front of the cameras before Trump went in the courtroom to allege election interference and to make note of the similarities between the timing of when Hunter Biden has news when people like Devin Archer testified. Then the next day you have the indictment in this case. And so a very interesting sort of point to make. I think also, you know, the one thing that I noticed as I did that live shot with you about 30 minutes ago, I went and just took a walk down on the 3rd Street to see the crowd, which are standing there waiting to get a glimpse of Trump when he leaves. It's fascinating. It's a mix of pro-Trump and anti-Trump, but literally at the crosswalk, we were waiting to cross the street, standing side by side, a gentleman holding a sign that said "Blacks for Trump" and a "Make America Great" hat, standing next to someone holding a sign that said "Lock him up." So it's peaceful out here, it's subdued, but really the story outside this courtroom is the massive amount of media that is covering this moment as we wait and watch on your camera there, the 3rd Street, where we expect the former president to leave in his motorcade, whether he'll wave to him or stop, who knows, or where he'll go. Remember, as I mentioned before, he went to a Cuban restaurant in Miami after his arraignment there back in June. No idea whether he'll go anywhere in town or whether he'll go straight to the airport and go back to Bedminster. We have to wait and find out. That's the situation here on the ground, Neil.
Good restaurants near there, pie shops or something that he could do that, you know?
Who knows? I mean, he could go anywhere. I suppose he has his motorcade to go, but I suspect he wants to get out of here because, remember, it's worth noting, and you can't overstate it, the proximity of the courthouse itself and where Mr. Trump sits right now is just 2 blocks, a short walking distance to the U.S. Capitol where the January 6th riots happened. And, of course, that is what Special Counsel Jack Smith is trying to do, is to tie him to that day and, of course, allege that he plotted to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Neil?
Griff, thank you, my friend. Great job, as always. I don't know if my next Donald knows good restaurants in the area. I know of a couple of good steak restaurants, but I'm not a Washingtonian. Martha McCallum certainly has been there. Now, she would know. Brett Baer would almost certainly know. I'd be disappointed if he did not. Andy McCarthy, John, you all back with us. So, Brett, what about that? I mean, the last time the president did go to that Cuban restaurant and, you know, goodies for everybody. I think he left without paying the bill. But what
around the block?
Okay,
from Charlie Palmer's Steakhouse. You got
there
the
you
monocle
go.
right
That gets
down
a little
the block.
pricey.
Yeah, it's a little pricey, but you could see a lot of lawmakers in there about lunchtime. It's a little past that now. Anyway, there's a lot of places to stop. I doubt he's going to say anything until he gets back to New Jersey, if I had to bet. Listen to the conversation, Neil, that you've been steering here. It's really interesting. And one of the things that I'm compelled to say is that no matter what happens in this courtroom when the trial gets underway under this judge that you just heard, you know, talk directly to the former president about his rights and the charges, there is an appellate process that Jonathan Turley talked about, and whether that's fast-tracked and whether it goes through that to the Supreme Court, you know, this president is directly responsible for choosing how this court in the Supreme Court has been put together now. And it is much more favorable on these particular issues, one would think, on appeal. It's hard to believe that the current Supreme Court would see too kindly on the stacking of these indictments against the former president as sort of planes coming into LaGuardia. I don't think that they would look kindly on that. And as far as the specifics, I mean, you've got legal experts who have real problems with this particular January 6th indictment. One of the laws, as I talked about before, was one of the charges deals with the law back in 1870 that Ulysses S. Grant helped pass. He signed into law to go after the Ku Klux Klan. Two of the charges deal with a law passed in 2002 that was post-Enron, dealing with fraud. One of the other charges deals with a law that really is designed for financial fraud on the government. So there is unique cobbling together on this indictment. Some people say it is very swift and it's tight. Others say it's a mess and it's bogus. And the appellate court is where it really is going to be vetted out. Then you have the Manhattan case that raises all kinds of questions. And I think most people say the real battle is going to be on the documents case, the Presidential Records Act, and what they have there might be the stiffest one so far that we've seen.
But you know, Brett, when you mention what they're going back to and piecing together to make their case today, that is prosecutors, when you're going back to a Ku Klux Klan era, piece of legislation, to some that would say, all right, man, you are searching here. And I'm just wondering how that would be interpreted.
I don't think well by this current Supreme Court. I don't know how it goes in this courtroom or in the appellate court, but just by reading how these justices have looked at other cases, I think the Trump team probably looks on appeal like they said pretty good. That doesn't take away from the seriousness of this issue, what he faces, the years in jail if he's convicted. All of these things are real. But there is an appeals process here that we should also put in the mix that eventually, potentially, ends up in the Supreme Court.
Wild stuff. I want to break away from the panel, and thank you, Brett. David Spunt. Now, he was in the courtroom when all of this was going on. He joins us now. David, what was it like in there?
Well, Neil, you know, it's over right now. It lasted probably about 20 minutes or so. Former President Trump walked in, waited for about 20 minutes for the magistrate judge. She's not going to be the judge that's actually running the show for the trial and for the next couple hearings, but he waited 20 minutes or so for the magistrate judge. He entered a plea of not guilty on all 4 counts. He stood up himself after he was sworn in. He was very stoic throughout most of the time he was there. He was talking to his attorney, Todd Blanche, just a few times. Also seated at the table was John Lauro, his attorney in this case. I did happen to notice that he looked over a few times at Jack Smith, the special counsel. He was probably maybe 20 feet away from Jack Smith, looked over at Jack Smith a few times. Jack Smith kept looking forward, did not appear to make any direct eye contact with the former president. Jack Smith also was looking at members of his team and talking with them and conferring with them. So right now we have the former president. This is his 3rd indictment in about 4 months. He pleaded not guilty, as I said, to all 4 counts. He looked very serious as the charges were read to him and as the prison sentences were read to him if he were found guilty, up to 20 years in prison in some cases. He looked very serious at that point. And the next hearing is going to be August 28th at 10 o'clock in the morning here in Washington, D.C. The magistrate judge said that she would waive the appearance for President Trump if he was not able to make it. So at this point, it's not clear if he's going to come or it's just going to be his attorneys. And that's pretty much what you have. We're at a courtroom right now, a court building that's just a stone's throw from the U.S. Capitol, a few blocks from the White House. And right now we're told that the motorcade is getting ready and the former president is getting ready to head to Reagan National Airport and fly back to New Jersey. Neil?
David, we're getting reports that the president was indeed processed by the U.S. Marshal's Office before any of this went down. They took his fingerprints, some personal information. They weren't saying anything about a mugshot taken. I would assume that's because he's probably among the most recognizable people on the planet. But what can you tell us about that?
No mugshot taken. Typically in federal courts, they don't take mugshots. They never release mugshots in the federal system. No mugshot taken for the exact reason you said. They have plenty of images of him. And this went very similar to what happened in Miami, which is another federal case. He was fingerprinted. He said today on his social media platform that he was going to be arrested. Technically speaking, he was not arrested today. He was appearing and answering a summons from the court. He was in the custody of the U.S. Marshals, but no FBI agents were involved. He was not handcuffed. He didn't have his hands behind his back. He was with his team. You saw a couple of aides that are with him frequently in his Secret Service detail. But while he was in the building, he was in the custody of the U.S. Marshals and had to do exactly what they said. And he stood up when the judge told him to stand up. She asked him his name. She asked him his age. She asked him if he took any medications in the last 24 hours. He said no. And he remained pretty stoic throughout the entire thing, Neil.
This is amazing. I guess we are getting used to this, aren't we, David? David, thank you very much. David Spunt. Back to my panel now. Martha McCallum back with us, and Brett Baer, Andy McCarthy, John Yoo. Martha, I caught you earlier in the last hour just talking about just the enormity of this and how we're sort of, I wouldn't say blasé about it. It was a big deal. The first one in New York, the Alvin Bragg, responding to that indictment, series of indictments. This is the third time, probably not the charm for the former president. There could be a fourth time here. But he knows the drill, and I think we as the viewing public know the drill.
Yeah, I'm not sure that anyone gets used to the part that he just went through, which is standing up and having the magistrate in this case read through the charges against him and the time that he would have to serve if he were found guilty on any of these counts. And the first one is conspiracy to defraud the U.S., which is interfering with an official proceeding, essentially. Not more than 5 years, fine of up to $250,000 or both. And then it goes on from there. And in some of these cases, the conspiracy charges, not more than 20 years. There's a lot of time that could add up here. So it's not surprising that he looked stoic during that period and that he took it seriously. But what strikes me as very interesting as I watch this play out, Neil, is the court of public opinion. And if you kind of take yourself back to this moment in time, back to January 6th, back to what happened at the Capitol, the beginnings of the former president saying that he wanted to contest the outcome of this election. It went through a number of different court processes, more than 50, I think. He was not, none of those decisions went his way. And then over the course of time, while all of this is played out with subsequent indictments in between, we've seen him gather strength. So I think there was a moment when most political observers thought he's done. I mean, this is, how would he ever go past this? A lot of people had real questions about the way that he responded that day, the things that he said, why he didn't tell people to go home. And even in this particular indictment, it doesn't mention that he told people to march peacefully and patriotically to the Capitol. But we all know that in the end, there were people who didn't do that, and many of them have been sentenced themselves. So I'm struck by the power of the public of court of opinion and what it's showing us in the polls that we're seeing right now. And that is how democracy functions. People choose the person they want to run, then they choose the person they want to be in the White House. And I think there's real questions about whether or not this interferes with that process that is in the middle of playing out. And I think it's highly likely that you're going to see federal judges who say that it's not viable to carry out these cases in the middle of a presidential election. So I think that's what's going to be really compelling here, that tension between this process and the court of public opinion. Yeah,
and that's the balance here. To that issue, Andy McCarthy, I know Bill Barr, when he was being interviewed, he had talked about the gravity of what's at stake for the former president here, saying that he had to know and did know, in fact, that he lost the election, referring to the former president. He says that Jack Smith has a lot more evidence on Donald Trump than this indictment is revealing. Do you think he's right?
I assume that that's correct, but, everybody is obsessed, it seems, and this was the focus of the interview with former Attorney General Barr, with Trump's state of mind and what he knew and what he believed. Barr's a perfect person to talk to about that because he had conversations with Trump at the critical time, and he knows what he told him. But I guess I keep looking at this from the other end, which is his state of mind doesn't make any difference unless what the government has charged him with is actually a crime. So, for example, if I'm right that the fraud count that defraud the United States, that the Supreme Court would say that that has to be a financial fraud and this isn't, then it really doesn't matter what he believed or what he said or whether he lied. They have to charge him with something that's actually criminal. And that's why I think Brett's point before about the appellate process here, what I've been straining my brain to figure out is, how does he get this case to the Court of Appeals? Maybe John has a better idea on this than I do. It's easy to see how he gets the Mar-a-Lago case up to the Court of Appeals, because that's controlled by a statute that controls classified information and provides for pretrial appeals. But the preference in the federal system is that you litigate the whole case in front of the trial judge, and if there's a conviction after sentencing, then the whole bundle goes up to the Court of Appeals, but not before. And he's got to figure out a way procedurally, I think, to get this case up to the D.C. Circuit and up to the Supreme Court prior to trial.
One other thing that's among the 4 counts here, John Yoo, is this obstruction of official proceeding and obstruction or conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. That again is linking Donald Trump to that, and that he was the cause and then the effect. That's a tough thing to prove. I think we're having problems with your mic, John, but go ahead. Maybe it's better now. All right, I apologize, John. We're going to try to fix that. But if I could go back to you on that, that it's a stretch to get some of these to stick. What do you think, Andy?
Well, I think it's going to be a stretch because I'm not sure they're crimes. You know, if it's right that the fraud has to be financial, there's no financial element to this. We heard some stuff in some of the reporting that, you know, maybe they would charge him with this idea that they raised money on the pretext that it was going to a fund to fight election fraud, and then they diverted the proceeds. That's like a conventional fraud. You could see where that would stick. Yeah. But I think what's going on here is that they have these legal concepts like corruption and fraud and civil rights, which are a little bit loosey-goosey. And what they're trying to do is stretch those concepts to pigeonhole his behavior into something that they can then brand as criminal.
Sorry, we just dropped
and that's going to be much tougher than they think.
All right, John Yoo, I think we have you back. That link and bringing Donald Trump to the January 6th event, it's not so black and white. It's not so quid pro quo. And ironically, while this is about January 6th, the difficulty is linking Donald Trump directly to it. But your thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, Neil, about my tech foul-up. You've got a great school of law here, the Cavuto School. You've got Andy covering the trial. I'm happy to take the appeals. And on what Andy said is completely right. Usually, and this is where the trial judge has complete discretion, I think, in this case, is the trial judge can say here, I want the whole case to go to verdict. And then after we see whether Trump's convicted or not, we'll let the issues like the one you just raised. Is Trump actually legally chargeable for obstruction of Congress? Go to the D.C. Circuit, which, by the way, is a very unfavorable circuit for Trump. Andy is right. The Supreme Court has been actually very reluctant to approve the use of fraud statutes, creative readings of criminal laws to interfere into what it thinks are really the mess of politics. You could easily see the Supreme Court reversing the use of the fraud statute, maybe even this obstruction statute, because, as you said, it was passed in the wake of Enron and was really aimed at people destroying documents or intimidating witnesses to appear before hearings. It's never really been used for something like this. And again, not for the connection with the people who attacked the January 6th attack, the Capitol. What Smith is really charging is that Trump violated the obstruction statute by trying to pressure Pence, by trying to pressure secretaries of state to not count the electoral vote. That's the line between, is that obstructing Congress, or is Trump just trying every crazy option he can think of under the rules and maybe a little bit outside the rules to change the results? The court is very reluctant, the Supreme Court's quite reluctant, I think, to use these criminal laws to intrude into what it thinks is, sort of the messy give and take and the brawling of politics. But this is where the trial judges, who the trial judge is really important. because someone who wanted to accelerate the case could send those issues, could halt the trial and say, I'm going to send those legal issues up to the D.C. Circuit, because that could end the whole case right away. But most trial judges, and I think Andy's right about this trial judge too, are more likely to say, let's have the whole trial first. Because if Donald Trump's acquitted, we don't even have to have any appeals. Let's see what happens, and then we can pick up these really important legal issues at the end.
Tom Dupree, is there a sense you get in a couple of minutes we have here that prosecutors will try to coordinate amongst themselves, whether it's Georgia next or maybe not, it's just the ones we have, and you're looking at how you arrange trials and follow-up events and are aware of the president's civil cases as well, or do you have to go blindly with that?
I suspect that the prosecutors will coordinate, Neil. I mean, right now we're in a situation that is bordering on literally impossible. Expecting the former president to defend himself in 3, now maybe possibly 4 criminal proceedings at the same time he's running for president of the United States. So number one, it wouldn't surprise me if the prosecutors coordinated and tried to plan things like, planes on a runway at an airport. Number two, it wouldn't surprise me if the judges picked up the phone and called one another and basically said, we got to figure out who's going to go first, who's going to go second, and how all of this is going to fall in line. Because if they don't coordinate and they let things just play out, you're going to have a very strange, unusual, and untenable situation with 4 cases all moving forward at the same time, which is unfair to any defendant.
Jonathan Turley, is it possible Jack Smith overplayed his hand?
Well, I think it is possible. This is not the indictment that most of us expected. I mean, most of us expected the indictment would be manifestly strong on the law and on the evidence. This didn't produce any new evidence, and it's stretching the law, and that's a reputation that Jack Smith has. He had a major fraud case that was overturned unanimously by the Supreme Court, and this sort of feels the same way. I think it is true that there will be this fight as to whether these threshold issues can go up on appeal. But this is a unique case. This is a president running for the 2024 presidency, and there may be exceptions here, but they will ask this court to effectively certify the question, to say, we'd like you to support the effort to get the Court of Appeals to determine if any case can be brought. There may be some people on the Supreme Court that find that attractive, because going through the normal steps of just trying this case and letting us figure out later if it should ever have been tried at all doesn't sit very well with this moment in time.
Got it. I want to thank you. Brett Baer, if you're still there, I'd like to go back to you. Those of you at home, the president is done in Washington. He's heading to Reagan National Airport. He's going to fly back to New Jersey, Bedminster. 2 very quick things, Brett. There is an IHOP on 14th Street Northwest, if the president didn't want to go really deep, or like Brett Baer treat deep.
Clearly, Neil, he's going to the airport, but I thought he could take the Key Bridge and go to Cafe Milano, where Hunter had dinner with then Vice President Biden.
Yeah, that actually would have been a
that
more...
fell in his wheelhouse.
I didn't know that. I'm looking for a Stuckey's or something there, but I don't see one. But Bradley, stepping back from this, I mean, getting ready, and you and Martha getting ready for the big debate, I think these developments, what do I know, but I think they have now risen to the point where if you're Donald Trump, you don't want to miss a chance to be on that stage.
He hasn't made that decision. He says he's really leaving it open, and he's hasn't, but he clearly has not closed the door. Bottom line is we're going to be prepared either way. Remember, back in the 2016 cycle, he did not come to the Iowa debate, the second one we held. And believe it or not, up until the last minute, we had 2 stacks of questions, one with Donald Trump and one without. And so I think we may be in that same boat, but he also may decide that this is the time, since, as you talked about before, he's sucking up all the oxygen politically in the room, to continue to do that and own that stage. We'll see.
And then very quickly, I mean, I always think of the money donors in these campaigns, whether they're frozen in place. I know they're still giving money out to candidates. That hasn't stopped. But does it give them pause?
For the other candidates, you mean?
Yeah.
Or the donors to him? Listen, every time we've seen one of these...
The donors to the other candidates, you think, oh, this guy is getting more popular as we speak?
I think there's a battle, Neil, to be the one alternative, whoever that is, depending on what this legal battle happens. But the former president is gaining money, and he's getting points in the GOP primary currently. As he said on True Social, I'm just one indictment away from wrapping this up.
Got it. Let me know if there's a Cinnabon at that airport. That's
right there.
Yeah, that's a slam dunk there. All right, final word. I want to thank all of you. Brett, thank you very much. Good luck on the show about an hour from now. For those who just joined us, Donald Trump has pled not guilty for a third.
Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm Caroline Shively. Breaking news at this hour in the area. You are looking at live pictures of a motorcade of former President Donald Trump as he returns from a D.C. courtroom. Former President Trump has pleaded not guilty to 4 federal charges related to attempts to overturn the 2020 election in the run-up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The former president and current presidential candidate sitting just 20 feet away from the special prosecutor during the 20-minute proceeding. The judge read the 4 counts to Trump, noting if convicted on all counts, he could be sentenced up to 55 years in prison. Reporters viewing from the overflow room described his expression as stoic. Here's how the day has played out so far. Trump left his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey this morning on the private plane you now see on that tarmac at Reagan National Airport. It was a quick flight landing at Reagan. Moments later, Trump's motorcade made its way to the courthouse in a 20-minute drive as live cameras rolled. Now, no cameras were allowed, however, as they entered the parking garage and on into the courthouse, where the former president had his fingerprints electronically taken. While he was inside, police swarmed the streets as just a few protesters on both sides chanted and sang songs, but for the most part remained orderly and calm. Also, while Trump was inside, his legal spokesperson, Alina Habba, addressed reporters, saying Trump will continue to fight, describing the federal investigation as a witch hunt, saying people are afraid of someone who could not be bought by Washington. Habba also said the investigation was an attempt to try to tie up an official who is running for office, so he will be distracted and can't properly run for president in 2024. Her final statement before the cameras, this is about politics 2024, period, the end. Prosecutors are not speaking out today, but special counsel Jack Smith emphasized earlier this week that all defendants are presumed innocent until proven otherwise. Justice Department officials say that politics plays absolutely no part in this case. The former president appeared in court beside his lawyers, who have given a glimpse at potential defense arguments in recent interviews. One, freedom of speech. Just like any of us, the First Amendment protects speech, even if it is untrue. But Trump's former Attorney General Bill Barr isn't buying that argument, saying you can lie, but not if you lie to perpetuate a crime. That alleged crime being trying to steal the 2020 election. The other potential defense could be advice of counsel. After the election, Trump had a number of lawyers telling him that he had a legal path to stay in the White House, including Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, John Eastman, and Jeffrey Clark. The next hearing in this case is set for August 28th. It is unclear if Trump will appear. Legal experts say those lawyers could be some of the 6 unindicted co-conspirators listed in the indictment, but as of now, they remain unnamed. This is, of course, the 3rd indictment for Trump this year. Today's 4 counts are among the 40 that Trump is facing in New York, Florida, and now Washington, D.C. The D.C. indictment was announced less than a week after special counsel Jack Smith added new felony counts to the case related to Trump's alleged retention of classified material at his Mar-a-Lago resort. He allegedly moved boxes containing classified documents from bathroom to ballroom to bedroom, trying to avoid returning them to the National Archives. That alleged scheme ended when the FBI removed the boxes in August of last year. Trump is also facing charges in New York City over alleged hush money payments to an adult film star ahead of the 2016 election. And he is now waiting to find out if he'll be indicted by a Georgia grand jury for trying to overturn Joe Biden's win there. The next step in this case, a hearing scheduled for August 28th. It's unclear if Trump will appear. It could be just his lawyers. All of this coming just months before the first voters head to the polls in the 2024 Republican presidential primary, where Trump remains the front runner. You are now looking at live photos at Reagan National Airport. There is former President Donald J. Trump coming to the camera. We expect him to speak any moment now. Let's listen.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very sad day for America, and it was also very sad driving through Washington, D.C. and seeing the filth and the decay and all of the broken buildings and walls and the graffiti. This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it. When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America. This is the persecution of the person that's leading by very, very substantial numbers in the Republican primary and leading Biden by a lot. So if you can't beat him, you persecute him or you prosecute him. We can't let this happen in America. Thank you very much.
Do you want these trials to happen before the 2024 election?
You heard it live. Former President Donald Trump, after pleading not guilty to 4 federal charges, addressing the cameras at Reagan National Airport. Stay tuned to this Fox station for more in this breaking news, the federal indictment of former President Donald Trump. I'm Caroline Shively in Washington.
This has been a Fox News special report.
Conference taking place. We did hear from President Trump after the first 2 indictments from earlier, so we'll continue to follow this here. Also a live picture from a little bit further away as the motorcade moving on as they will get on the plane. The press will head back to New Jersey, also aides and officials around him. So this was our picture here on Live Now from Fox. Let's take you right back out, though, to our Fox 5 team there in Washington, D.C. as they continue to cover this as well.
Related to January 6th, and she has in fact ruled against President Trump in the past in his bid to keep the National Archives from handing over some of his records to the House Select Committee investigating January 6th. So during that hearing, presumably they'll walk through a potential trial schedule and any preliminary matters or motions that either party would expect to make over the coming weeks and months and see how quickly they're interested in moving to trial. And speaking to a number of people who are familiar with Judge Chutkan, she can move quickly, and there are no bones about it. She can move with all due haste if that is in the interest of both parties, which may or may not be the case here. President Trump and his legal team have been approaching these cases with a delay tactic. So we'll see if he does the same thing in this case as well. We know that he appeared with Todd Blanche, the same attorney he appeared with in both New York and Miami, and John Lauro, who has also been making the rounds on television, already making some of the defense arguments that we could possibly expect to hear from the former president should this case go to trial.
All right, Katie, we'll get back to you in just a few moments, but we also want to take a look at what's happening on social media. A lot of people weighing in. There's a lot of mixed reaction online to the former president's indictment and his court appearance today. Some people saying they are definitely going to vote for him, for Mr. Trump, if he wins the Republican nomination for the 2024 presidential election. As I mentioned before, he has touted this indictment as part of his campaign. And others, though, are saying they don't care. They really don't want him to see, move forward with this. They'd like to see him behind bars. So really a mixed reaction. I will say, though, we have had Josh Rosenthal out there on the scene outside of the courthouse. He has said it has been primarily peaceful, which is nice to see from both those that are for the former president and those who are against him. It is nice to see at least this is not getting out of control in regards to what we're seeing.
We're going to keep our eyes on what's going on online, in person, and everywhere else, of course, as this continues. But again, former President Trump back on his plane and getting ready to head back to New Jersey after his second federal indictment, this time here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and we also have a Fox 5 Insta poll question up right now. Do you think the former president...
You're just listening in there to our Fox 5 team. Again, I want to give you a picture out there on the tarmac. This is a live picture here as President Trump there, former President Trump departing this. He faces those 4 different charges, pleading not guilty to all of them here from earlier, but this is a live picture here as we will await his departure on this tarmac. It was a quick trip there to Washington, D.C. Of course, at other indictments, including the first one in New York City. He did arrive in New York the night before going to the courthouse on the next morning of that arraignment. Still a very quick arraignment, just about an hour or so. Former President Trump alongside as well inside of the courtroom, special counsel there, Jack Smith, as they are waiting. So you can see the plane slowly start to move here as this was happening, facing those 4 counts. Of course, Trump there pleading not guilty after he's indicted on felony charges for working to overturn the results of the 2020 election in the run-up to the violent riot by his supporters at the U.S. Capitol. This 4-count indictment, the third criminal case against Trump, provided deeper insight into a dark moment that has already been the subject of an exhaustive federal investigation, certainly captivating a lot of people. Of course, early in the year, a rapid succession legal reckonings for Trump. Tuesday's indictment with charges including conspiring to defraud the United States government that he once led was stunning in its allegations. It's the first time the defeated president, who is the early frontrunner for next year's Republican presidential nomination, is facing legal consequences for his frantic but ultimately failed effort to cling to power there in Washington, D.C. I'm Andy Mack here on Live Now from Fox. We're watching this unfold. Let's slide away for a quick break before he departs for Bedminster once more.
Get the app. Watch us live. Take us
anywhere. Get the app.
Watch us live. Take us anywhere.
Fox 26 is now streaming free on Fox Local. Download now on your preferred streaming device for live newscasts and more. Nobody does more during hurricane season than your Gulf Coast Weather Authority.
Coverage on air, online, on our weather app, and on social. Scan the code for a fast and free download.
Daily tropical updates give you the earliest possible warnings of developing storms.
Testing and rating the gear you need to prepare for the season.
Important information in both English and Spanish.
Detailed weather reporting with facts, not fear, from Fox 26, your Gulf Coast Weather Authority.
The Fox 26 Weather app with more features in one easy-to-use screen. Current weather at a glance, high-resolution interactive radar, severe weather alerts, video forecasts, and much more. It's the power of your Gulf Coast Weather Authority in the palm of your hand. The Fox 26